Hello, my name is Mustafa,
And my name is Patrick.
and this is our Theory of Knowledge presentation. In June of 2019, several students, alongside their college admission counselors, were found guilty of fraudulent behavior, and they had essentially tampered with their college applications to certain University of California schools in order to get into the schools that they wanted to go to. And with this recent scandal, it shows the ever-increasing competition that students around the world are facing in order to get into top universities. And this brings us to our ethical dilemma and real-life situation. Should students fabricate information on their college application knowing that they'll have better chances of getting in, or do they just simply tell the truth, knowing that there are other kids with more impressive resumes and applications than them, whether those are fabricated or not? And these students are faced with a very difficult decision that puts into question both their ethics and the ethics of everyone around them. This leads us to an even more important question, though. How does an individual really measure the consequences of a decision on both themselves and the society that they live in? We believe that one can measure these consequences by factoring in both personal and shared ethics among the individual in question, alongside other individuals within that same society. And essentially, personal ethics are defined as the guidelines or the rule book, basically, by which an individual abides by or follows to develop a certain system of values. And in that same sense, shared ethics is the same concept, but expanded to a horizon of a community or society by which all members abide by to develop similar values. In the world of arts, for example, originality in one's work is a very sacred thing, and an artist could steal the content or work of another artist off of a public internet forum and post it somewhere else where the artist taking the work has gathered a larger and more faithful following and therefore profits off of the stolen work. These profits would be going to support both the artist himself and possibly his or her family. And one artist in this situation benefits, but what really happens is that the artist whose work is being stolen is being put financially at risk, and therefore the artist stealing the art would be putting those people's lives in danger, as they would not be able to supply themselves or fend for themselves without that money that was basically being stolen from them. And this plagiarism and this stealing of work or content would be measured against one's personal ethical beliefs, along with the shared ethical beliefs of those around them. From a deontologist perspective, one can say that the stealing of the work was just still ethically wrong, no matter if the artist was stealing it to feed his own family or not. But from a consequentialist perspective, one can say that the stealing of the work was okay, since the artist that was stealing the work would have suffered the consequences as well, alongside his family too. So, taking into consideration both the personal and shared ethics of this very specific instance, one can see the effects and measure the effects of one's actions on other people. An individual's personal ethics in this instance depends on their view of stealing and plagiarizing work. Then the consequences would be very severe, as the individual would be maintaining a deontologist belief, since both their personal ethics and their shared ethics would not allow for them to make such a decision in stealing someone else's work and profiting off of it.
Alright, so in contrast to Mustafa's point, a situation in the world of arts can also be interpreted with where an individual is not stealing, because the idea or product is released with no prior trademark or legal binds, meaning it can be used for anyone else's project without having to have any kind of consequence, basically. A perfect example of this dilemma is the PUBG versus Fortnite lawsuit over the concept of a battle royale game. Essentially, a battle royale game is where a player is dropped into an island or an arena in which they have to be the last man standing. Tencent, the company that made PUBG, or PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, was the first company to ever come up with the idea of a battle royale, where it involves 100 players. Soon after PUBG's release, Epic Games, another gaming company, released Fortnite, a game that is very closely similar to PUBG. Soon after the release, there was public outcry where the game was being a cheap copy of PUBG, basically, and it is becoming way more popular than PUBG. That is why Tencent decided to file a lawsuit against Fortnite due to the developers being very concerned about the similarity of the two games. The lawsuit eventually ended with PUBG dropping the case because even though it was released before Fortnite, the company Tencent did not trademark the idea of a battle royale. In this situation, it was perfectly legal for Fortnite to profit off of the same concept of a battle royale, just like Tencent's, because it just is not considered stealing. Unless there was a trademark on the game or the idea, then it is fair game for anyone to be inspired or to make something similar to that product. The individual is simply inspired by another individual's project that happens to not be protected by any kind of trademark or copyright law that is making the concept of a battle royale game exclusive to Tencent. And one can measure the consequences of their actions here and bring into light both personal and shared ethics. The developers of Fortnite never broke the law, and so then therefore certain individual systems of thought could almost justify the similarities, since no one broke the law. In shared ethics, committing serious crimes is generally seen as an unethical thing to do. Although the concept of a battle royale game was not trademarked legally, an entire company and its development team worked very hard on the concept just to be overshadowed by an unbelievably similar game. And in addition, that game didn't recognize the work that it was inspired by. The lack of receiving credit that is deserved for one's work violates one's personal ethics, regardless of the fact that societal ethics were not broken, since the law was being followed. In this situation, not only did Tencent's PUBG not get the recognition or credit that it deserves from inspiring games like Fortnite and other battle royale games, but it's become less successful and popular altogether because newer games are being made with the same exact concept, resulting in a lower revenue for the team that worked on PUBG, which was the originator of this concept. And plagiarizing work in this sense is still plagiarism. This can play really heavily into any individual's personal ethics because you are, in the end, hurting someone else's reputation or occupation. And the entire workforce that worked on PUBG is being affected just because Epic Games decided to borrow the Battle Royale concept. And also, taking work without credit is essentially considered stealing by one's own individual ethical system or anyone else's ethical system at this point.
We can also see examples of this when we look back into United States history, and we can find that during the 1700s and the 1800s in the United States history, slavery was very commonplace. In fact, our past involvement in the Atlantic slave trade was quite significant, and we were one of the few remaining countries at the time leading up to the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment to still institutionalize and legalize slavery. And at this time, owning slaves was legal in most southern states, and using them for money was very common. And essentially what these farmers would do, whether they were small-scale or large-scale plantations, they would essentially just use the imported slave labor to increase their earnings and produce more of a yield in their crop, since they don't have to pay the slaves anything for working for them. Now, of course, owning and working another human being is just never okay, and there will never be a good reason to own somebody else. But at this time, individuals in Southern society held a very different perspective on this matter. Southerners really saw the owning of other human beings as perfectly okay, and they justified it in many different ways. They, in some cases used religion and in some cases, quote unquote, science to justify their superiority over the African slaves. And it is demonstrated in this time period that the personal ethics of Southern plantation owners and farmers and people who just own slaves, and the shared ethics of the Southern society, which accepted slavery as a common practice at the time, saw no problem with owning African slaves because they believed it was morally right and ethically right for them to do so because of their belief of them being inferior. In other words, it was within many people's ethical guidelines to manipulate and essentially just work another human being for monetary gain. The ultimate consequences of their actions was, at the end of the day, just monetary gain. In addition, it was so encouraged back in the day that nobody really saw it as wrong. Now, this is where we see the shift in today's world. Many other countries and people now understand and know that owning another human being is completely wrong, and legalized slavery is nearly abolished all over the world. But this shift in thinking, and as a result, the shift in the sharing of people's personal ethics and knowledge of their views on slavery into the shared ethics and shared knowledge into the society about slavery, evolved, and now they understand the true consequence of what it means to essentially own another human being.
Alright, so the other perspective to Mustafa's example is the use of torture during times of war or conflict between nations or militaristic groups. And today, in today's society, the war on terror is more prominent than ever. Torture is the act of inflicting pain on an individual in the hopes of gaining wanted information from a suspect or a person of interest. And some argue that torture is the only way to get such information. An example of this use in today's society in the war of terror is where the United States government having to use these tactics of torture to extract information that could possibly save a life or even 1,000 lives. And the justification for the US resorting to such actions is that the terrorists that we're going against also torture American soldiers. And when looking at these consequences, you can see how important the value of saving and protecting lives is. And it's present in many personal and shared ethical systems. A consequentialist mindset is present in this type of situation because hurting one person remains right in the saving of lives of hundreds, if not thousands more. In situations where the lesser evil has to be chosen, the question is always that if everyone else is doing something with no consequence, why can't I do the same thing? This same justification is commonly used during times of war, when soldiers and the government are forced to do violent and inhumane acts to win the battle. Ethically, of course, it's not acceptable to inflict pain on any human, but there is an exception that develops when dealing with the possibility of saving lives in the present or in the future. The government of any nation wants their own citizens and people to stay safe and protected under their rule. And a life or hundreds of lives in exchange for inflicting severe pain on an enemy will always be the lesser evil in the eyes of any individual that is given this dilemma. This line of thinking, however, is inherently wrong. Inflicting permanent trauma and pain onto someone it's still not accepted in many personal and shared ethical systems before consequence. In addition, doing so would stoop to the level of the terrorist even. And in the societal system of Islamic extremists, torture is ethically tolerable, and depending on where the individual comes from, their society's shared ethical standpoints could also contradict those of the terrorists.
This sort of, if everyone is doing it, why can't I kind of mindset or line of reasoning brings us back to the real world. Another relevant example in which we see this line of reasoning used so commonly, almost to a fault, is in standardized testing. In the United States, students have to take standardized testing in order to apply and get into many universities or college programs. And these standardized tests are often a measure of where you're going to be going to university. So, a student, and many students have done this in the past, where they cheat on an SAT, standardized test, because it was tempting to see if they could get a good score while cheating. This is also factoring in the knowledge that they know other students are going to cheat, so they factor in the mindset of, if everyone's doing it, why can't I? It almost seems to put the individual at a disadvantage if they don't, knowing that scores are curved and getting a good score would only mean that other students getting a good score means that you have worse chances of scoring higher due to this curve. But being dishonest about yourself, being dishonest about your score to yourself, society, and colleges, just in order to get into a good school, can be ignored by those people who truly believe the ends justify the means. Once again, though, a consequence of such actions also ends with the demise of others, and such harm can be a violation of one's personal or society's shared ethics. For example, when other kids who legitimately study for the test and they put their all into it and try and score a good score without cheating, they are the ones who are suffering the consequences of someone else's actions. And in the end, one's personal or society's shared ethics generally do not reflect well on harming other people. And once again, this brings us full circle to our first real life situation of lying or just cheating on your college application. We now understand why fabricating information on a college application is wrong, since no matter what happens, there are consequences that will violate personally what you believe in, and there are consequences that will definitely violate what values and ethics your society holds true and maintains. You know, cheating those other kids out of a mission and harming them is never really looked upon very nicely.
And in looking at all the different perspectives and different life situations within the different areas of knowledge, it can be clearly seen that there can be a measure of the consequence of a decision as long as the individual puts into account one's personal ethics as well as shared ethics. And that is how one will get to
truly measure the consequences of their decisions.
Thank you.
Here.